Hello everybody, welcome back to OMB Reviews. I am the critic who is a cynic. Hope you're doing well, and today we'll be doing a box office breakdown for this past weekend, which saw Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny set to lose hundreds of millions of dollars, upwards of maybe even $250 million in financial losses for Disney after only opening to $60 million domestically, which was on the low end of the estimates going into the weekend, and opening to only $130 million internationally. And that's right, Nance, I did find your article. You hit it under the business section, even though your title clearly says international box office. Why are you hiding it under the business section and not the box office section? That's my major question. And also, when did this become a thing? I don't know why it's been a lot harder to find your articles more recently. Oh, but wait a minute, now it makes more sense when you are hiding it under this one instead. I don't understand it. It used to be clearly visible under the box office section whenever I would look, but hey, I found it, I hunted for it, and got it, and we got the numbers for you. Let's go ahead and break this stuff down. Before going any further, though, please make sure you smash that like button, lap that fire button, obviously, and smash the rumble button as well. And also make sure that you are subscribed to the channel with that bell notification on. That way you know every time a new video or live stream goes live on the channel. So as you can see, the headline from Deadline, Indiana Jones and the Box Office of Doom. Oh, don't you always love how Tony and Nance at Deadline are always coming up with these very, very clever titles? You know what would be a better one? Man Not So Gold at the box office. I could do it too, Tony. So freaking stupid. But this is abysmal. This is awful. This is absolute doom for them. So he is at least right on that front. Even worse when you look at the international numbers. Keep in mind that when you look at the film Crystal Skull, and I'll call it Crystal Skull because to call it Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull, or whatever the official title for that movie is still going to be an insult because most people do not acknowledge that, or this movie for that matter, as being truly an Indiana Jones movie, and these box office numbers are starting to showcase that. Also, don't forget that every Indiana Jones film, including the not-to-be-counted Crystal Skull, made over $1 billion when you adjust the numbers for inflation. Every single Indiana Jones film. This film at this point will be lucky to get to $400 million internationally, meaning not only will it be the worst performing Indiana Jones film, but also it will be not just the biggest box office flop of the entire franchise, but possibly of the past year, maybe even past several years. I'll have to actually try to break down that data because let's just say the losses for this movie are set to be quite abysmal. Going to the actual numbers.com to look at the numbers domestically for a moment. First off, Indiana Jones Dial of Destiny, $60 million at 4,600 screens. What's most interesting about this is the fact that if you actually look at some of these numbers and compare it to the original films, right? The original trilogy. We've talked about this chart actually on the live streams on the channel. And that is that if you actually go back to Raiders of the Lost Ark, yes, when you adjust for inflation, that is still the lowest opening weekend of the entire franchise. The difference, though, is if you look at that 27 million adjusted, on average, that would be about 3 million tickets on its opening weekend. It was only available at 1,000 screens. Compare that to Dial of Destiny, which is available at a whopping 4,600 screens, and it only made about $30 million more and only sold about maybe 1 million or $1.5 million more tickets. So what you see from that is even though Raiders did not make as much opening weekend, for all intents and purposes, Dial of Destiny has the worst opening of the entire franchise, especially when you take into account the differences in theater. Again, Indiana Jones Dial of Destiny at over 4,600 screens, $13,000 per theater, and that number is set to be even lower next weekend as it's expected to have a massive flop. This movie is not getting very good word of mouth, so I do not suspect that this film will have any type of hold to speak of. Doesn't really matter what Disney does at this point in time. They could promise they could promise the world to anyone going to see this movie, and I still think most people would say, no thank you, I would rather just stay at home and not waste 2.5 hours plus of my life on something that is complete and utter garbage. Coming in the number 2 spot, to somewhat of a surprise, the projections going into the weekend were that this movie was going to come in underneath Elemental, at least according to Box Office Pro, but very happy to see this because I think this is a superior movie. I've not yet seen Elemental, but everything about it trailer-wise just seems so uninteresting and so generic. It's kept me from ever having a desire to really go see it, and based on what I've heard from others who have seen both movies, it really isn't all that special. Now, granted, Spider-Verse is also having its own problems, and I ultimately think that this film is okay, is decent, but is not perfect either. It is still the better movie, and it is doing better at the box office and doing very well at the box office. In fact, after 5 weeks of release, this movie is still doing better than films that have even less time underneath it, including the opening weekend for the number 6. That's right, number 6 domestic movie, Ruby Gillman, Teenage Kraken. That film only made $5.2 million at over 3,400 screens. That is an abysmal per theater ratio. No one's going to see this movie, and I can't say I'm surprised. A lot of people, I would not be surprised, will go on to say, I didn't even know this movie existed. What the heck is this movie? Haven't even heard of it. I've just seen the trailer for this film several times. That's the only reason why I even knew about it going into the weekend. But the trailers don't really seem all that compelling. Can't say I'm surprised then that people are not taking their kids to actually go and see this film. But coming in even before Ruby Gillman, though, Spider-Verse, 11.5 million, 39% hold, so very strong numbers there. That film probably going to get to, easily will get to $350 million domestic, probably will even get north of $400 million domestic. So this film's set to probably make 700 plus million worldwide when it is, everything is said and done. So very, very impressive movie and release from Sony Pictures. Elemental from Disney, even though the numbers and the holds percentage-wise seem fine, and $3,000 per screen, not terrible 3 weeks out at this point in time, at least compared to the other films that are currently still available. But when you remember that this film had a very, very low opening weekend in the $30 million range, when you're having these kind of percentage drops, again, the percentage might seem strong, but if you're dropping very small from a very small number, it doesn't mean a whole lot in the end. This film's only at $88.7 million. Probably will get some 100 plus million domestically, but it's not doing much of anything internationally in comparison. So this film is still set to be a massive flop for Disney, probably well north of $150 million when everything is said and done. When you add that to possibly the $250 million loss of Dial of Destiny, you've got 2 films in the top 3 box office right now that are going to account to almost $500 million worth of financial losses. Again, could not happen to a nicer company in Disney. No hard feelings. Speaking of not so nice people. Yes, all right. Jennifer Lawrence proving herself to not be a box office draw, dropping 50% in its second week of release. Even though this film only cost about $45 million to make, still need to make money. No one's really going to see it. This film also set to be a financial failure, though let's be honest here, financial failure for No Hard Feelings is not going to be anything in comparison to what we've seen in those previous movies. Speaking of also financial failures, Transformers Rise of the Beast dropping 40%. So again, on paper, domestically, the holds have not been terrible for this movie. Has made $136 million domestically. It's just not doing much anywhere else and is not doing nearly enough to justify the massive budget that this film had, close to, I think, $200 million in budget. And it just goes to show you that the Transformers franchise has just really honestly been destroyed by everything that Michael Bay did in the previous installments. Ruby Gillman, we've already talked about that. Coming in the number 7 spot, again, is Little Mermaid from Walt Disney, $5.1 million. It's interesting that this movie, even though it is doing quite abysmal, and still set to lose about $100 million for Disney, might end up being the lesser of the flops for Disney in the long run. So that is, again, the state of where Disney is right now, is that a $100 million loss movie is a best case scenario for its initial releases. Other than Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, there are really no victories. There are no wins that Disney has as far as the last several months, let alone the summertime. And for Disney to have nothing but financial losses and financial flops at the box office for this in the entire summer, and the prospects don't really look all that much better for anything else set to come out, danger, danger, Will Robinson, if you are a Disney stockholder. And if you are still holding Disney stock at this point, I don't know what you're doing. And I don't know why you're not calling up every single person you can on the board of directors to say, you need to start firing some people. I would say start with people like Kathleen Kennedy, but as we all know, Kathleen Kennedy is kind of like Teflon at this point in time, and anyone that was reporting that she's going to get fired, again, at this point, it's coming from people that have reported that years now. Every year, there's a new report from the same people saying the same thing. So it's almost as if, okay, if they're right this time, that doesn't mean that their sources were good or that they themselves are a good place to go to, because if they happen to be right the 1 year, subsequent years in a row, since 2017 or so, they've been saying this, all of a sudden now they happen to be correct? Come on. Like, let's just move past the fact that these people have any sense of integrity left at this point in time. Anyway, The Flash, Warner Brothers, The Flash, set to also be a massive flop. This movie was dropped from 1,500 screens in the third week of its release. This is almost unheard of. You almost never see movies get dropped from a lot of theaters, let alone this many theaters, 3 weeks out from its initial release. So Warner Brothers is clearly just giving up on this movie. They saw the writing on the wall. And they said, screw it. This movie has not even gotten to $100 million domestically yet at this point in time. So yeah, Warner Brothers, The Flash, set to be a big loss. But this has got nothing on Indiana Jones, and possibly not even nothing on Elemental either. That's how bad this movie is doing, but how much worse those other films are doing in hindsight. Asteroid City is the Focus Features movie. This is the Wes Anderson film at another 226 movies. It has another one of these weird releases where it starts off in a very small amount of theaters and then they're adding a little bit more to it. I'm kind of interested in it. I happen to be a fan of Wes Anderson movies. I hear this is the most Wes Anderson of Wes Anderson movies, to a point that even huge fans have said it was too much for me. But I'll have to wait and see. I might try and go see this film tomorrow. And then rounding out the top 10 is Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, the only profitable movie from Disney this year, but its profits are not going to come anywhere close to being enough to cover for their financial losses, especially for this bad boy right here. $130 million worldwide at this point in time. As a frame of reference, that's only 0.4 times its budget. These movies need to make roughly 2.5 to 3 times their budget if they want to break even. So being at 0.4 times your budget globally, and prospects are not looking good that you're going to get that much far past 1 times your budget, is saying quite a bit about the financial chances. We'll break down the chart about this film and where this film currently stands and where it likely will end up in just a few minutes. Spider-Verse is at $607 million worldwide, so again, very impressive numbers here. At a $100 million budget, this film is 4.5 times its budget. So continuing to add to its profits, well north of $100 million in net gain profits. So even though there are definitely a lot of problems that one can point out in this movie, we cannot deny the fact that this movie is a financial hit, is a financial success. And so, hey, kudos to y'all for being able to make a film that made money. Another film that was not able to do so is Elemental, only at $186 million worldwide. As a frame of reference, that is 0.9 times its budget of $200 million. Again, Disney continuing to spend crap tons of money on films that have no reason to cost as much as they do. No Hard Feelings at $45 million of a budget has only made $49 million. So when you take into account marketing cost and also the fact studios don't get 100% of their box office back, this film set to be a flop. So hey, hope it was worth it, Jennifer Lawrence. Anyway, Transformers Rise of the Beast, $379 million. Again, on paper, that doesn't sound a whole lot bad. That doesn't sound too bad. But again, $195 million in a budget, so most, closer to $200 million, is only 1.9 times its budget. It's getting close to the end of its initial release, so it's not got enough in the tank at this point to get up to 2.5 times the budget, which would be a low-end break-even point. So this film's set to be a box office flop. Not as big as some of the others we've talked about, but still a big one nonetheless. And even though Ruby Gillman, Teenage Kraken, has only cost $70 million, so not a terrible budget in comparison to some of these other films, right? This is the same studio that brought you Shrek and How to Train Your Dragon. Well, it looks like it's also the studio that brought you a likely box office flop. Only $5.2 million domestic, only $7.5 million international. I can't really stress how bad that is. This film came out in markets like Mexico, the UK, Spain, France, Germany. I mean, this film came out in the vast majority of markets that it's going to come out in. I mean, Australia is not going to be a major market for this film anyway, so that's not going to save the film in September. You have a later release, a week delay in Italy. You have even bigger delay in Japan. But again, what Japan has shown us is that when you have these kind of delays, it doesn't really end up doing all that well. So if you're expecting Japan, Italy, South Korea to come in and save this movie, that probably won't end up happening. So unless we see some huge change happen over the course of this week, I mean, you would have to see the best word of mouth on any film that you've ever seen. Again, we have seen this happen with DreamWorks previously, with the Puss in Boots movie, for instance. That film did not have a strong opening and had very strong holds for a long time. That film, though, was definitely helped by having a holiday frame, a very long, extended holiday frame to be able to do that. It was also a really good movie and had good word of mouth. This film, I have not heard anything about it, good or bad, and I think that it's worse to be in a situation where no one's talking about you at all, versus being talked even about in a bad way. Let's just say, not good numbers for this film. The Little Mermaid at $523.7 million is, again, getting to the point of not making any more money. So this film is pretty much donezo, and the low-end $625 million break-even point is not going to get hit by this movie, which is why we're looking at $100+ million in financial losses for Disney just for that film. The Flash is also slowing down after just a few weeks of release. Again, I can't believe that it's not even at $100 million yet. I mean, I can because I've seen the movie, but this film is so abysmal, is so bad. The fact that the studio is abandoning it the way that it is, this film set to lose quite a bit of money. Right now, only 1.2 times the budget So a very far cry from the 2.5 minimum it would need to make. Asteroid City, $29.4 million. This is one of those smaller budgeted movies, so these typically we can't say much about until the actual release is done. Guardians Volume 3, $827. So I still think $850 is possible. It didn't add a whole lot between this week and last week. It looks like it is in its final leg in the box office, so $850 might be out of reach at this point in time. But hey, kudos to them for being able to make at least one profitable movie this year, and it happened to be a film starring Chris Pratt. The Boogeyman is also another film that is coming from, at least associated with Disney. I believe that this is a 20th Century Studios release. It is. This film, though, did not cost too much money. However, it's also not making a whole lot of money, so this is yet another financial flop for them in that case. Fast 10 is also still hanging around, kind of, but it's pretty much done and still also a giant flop. And the reason why ultimately is because this film cost $340 million to make. So keep in mind that if Indiana Jones was seeing movies like that at $300 million, that still wouldn't be great. The fact that this movie got to $707 million and the vast majority, I mean, this type of split you don't see too often. 145 million domestic versus 560 international. And the vast majority of that, 139 coming from China. Yeah, that's why this movie is not only a flop, but also probably lost a lot more than what a typical movie would be because of that kind of split that it's seeing right there. Super Mario Bros. Also added a little bit more to its numbers too. Let's go ahead and dive into the box office charting because we love doing charting here over at OMB Reviews. So remember how we have now been using for the past several weeks different metrics when it comes to figuring out what a film can make after its opening weekend. And remember, I was able to figure out that most movies on average will make about a third of their entire box office globally, if it's a global release, in the first week of its release. If we take that into account, it means the $12.7 million made by Ruby Gillman, Teenage Kraken, means the film will top out somewhere between, $40 to $50 million worldwide, if those numbers hold. And even though at $70 million, its break-even point's only $175, as compared to the $750 million break-even point, minimum break-even point of Indiana Jones Dial of Destiny, it is still going to be quite a far cry from that break-even. So we're looking at Ruby Gillman probably ending up being a $50 million loss when everything is said and done, unless we see some major changes happen, which at this point I just don't see happening. But again, you never know. Some strange things have happened before, but right now that film is set to be a massive flop, though not nearly as big as what we're seeing with Dial of Destiny. And I'm sure that a lot of y'all have been kind of waiting for this one. So remember, using that same metric, now that this film has come in $10 million underneath where this other movie came in, just doing some quick math on this, that $130 million, if that accounts for roughly a third, that means that you're looking at this movie not even getting to $400 million, or barely getting to $400 million worldwide. And if it only gets to $400 million worldwide, look at what right now this movie's losses are standing at. This is something that I have not seen yet this year. Right now, this film is at $372 million in the red. Even if it does get to $400 million, that would mean this film would still be around a $250 plus million loss. That is how bad this movie is doing. So let's go ahead and wait and see what happens by next weekend, because if this film is only getting to or barely getting to $200 million domestic by that weekend, that would mean a best case scenario would be $400 million, right? So I think that that's going to be interesting to see. In fact, let's go ahead and try and see if we can get this chart to work for us, because we like to do things live here on the channel just so that way we can get a little bit of a frame of reference. So let's say it does somehow get around that amount of money, of $400 million at the box office. That would mean you would see in a best case scenario, and again, this is using the lower end 2.5 times multiplier, $210 million in losses. So when you take into account that it's probably a lot higher than that, because the marketing costs are probably a lot higher. Also, we do know the relationship between theaters and studios has changed somewhat. To what degree is still a little bit difficult to tell. But also, there's a good chance that this film doesn't even get to $400 million, because again, this is more of a best case scenario really at this point. So that's why I'm looking at this movie saying, I think this movie will probably end up losing $250 million and maybe even more than $250 million. That is abysmal. Couldn't happen to a nicer company. No hard feelings. With this now being the second week of its release, we can project that the film will lose somewhere between $25 million and around $8 million. So it's not going to be a huge loss for them in the long run, but it does show us that, hey, you're not a box office draw, Jennifer Lawrence, so maybe you should stop talking your nonsense and just focus on choosing better projects. That would be my advice, my, clearly important financial advice from someone that has, a very small and humble YouTube channel. Coming from our Elemental, again, we did the projections on this last weekend. Right now at 186 million, it currently is around 187 million in financial losses. What's interesting though is this number here. So this is the actual percentage. So remember when I make my projections, right? When I say what the total box office will end up being, which is also how I account for what the likely losses will be, normally the films fall somewhere between that 50 and 70% mark. So this movie is actually, because it's performing better domestically, and it's week to week, again, this is where the strongholds come in, it is actually chipping away at this number. So this film actually could end up being a chart breaker in the positive direction, meaning it could end up doubling what it made in the first 2 weeks. The problem though, even if it does get to that point, it would still not be enough to actually break even because it costs so much to make, and because that opening weekend number, which remember, you can have strong holds, but if that opening weekend, the starting point for all those percentages is not high, it doesn't make much of a difference in the end. So this movie is still set to lose between $150 and $200 million. And again, that's on the lower side of things. If you use a 3 times multiplier, it would go up, again, probably about a $50 million loss or so. So you're looking at somewhere between, $150 and $250 in potential losses for this film. That would also ultimately put Indiana Jones in a position where it's probably even possible that it gets a $300 million in losses for Disney. And again, the question has to be asked, how is no one at this point getting fired? The updated numbers for Elemental, again, still do point to some problems. For The Flash at $244 million, and Warner Brothers seemingly just abandoning this movie altogether. As you can see, its percentage is not good, meaning that this is probably going to end up being on that higher end, meaning that $150+ million in losses. So this film also probably has a range, depending on what metric you use, of 150 to 250 in financial losses. These are abysmal numbers for this movie. So even though Disney's in a much worse position at this point in time, Warner Brothers is not in a good position by any means. Transformers Rise of the Beast still at 72 million in the red, so probably will end up still following historical standards. Spider-Verse, as you can see, is falling very much in line with what most films perform. Not that great, but also about average. Boogeyman also about average. And then we have other films that have pretty much been out of theaters. As you can see, also Little Mermaid, because its domestic holds have actually been a little bit better than what would have been perceived. This film's also actually performing as an average movie, but as I mentioned, even when this film came out, even if it had those average performances, right? Even if it had those average drops, because that opening weekend was not nearly as high, and because its international numbers especially were not very good, this movie is still set to also be a financial failure. Now, remember that the metric that I use has this film having that potential to make money, but when you take into account that some people's break-even point is going to be 3 times the budget, you can see why this film's, again, losses are probably going to be closer to that average number, so probably still going to be somewhere between 40 and maybe a little over $100 million in losses. What does that mean? When a $100 million loss film in Little Mermaid is one of the better performing films, again, you have a $100 million loss in Little Mermaid, and then the next best movie for Disney is what? As far as major mainstream Disney releases, not counting the 20th Century Studio release, the best performing film would be Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, which saw about $100 million in profits. So you have $100 million profitable movie, one movie that made that, and then you've got several films that are losing anywhere between $100 and $300 million, and several of them at that, and the year ain't over. Disney in a lot of trouble. Valiant Renegade, when he was talking about the $900 million in losses that this studio has seen, we're talking about the potential for this studio to see upwards of $1 billion in financial losses by the end of this year. And again, as I've said several times and will continue to say, could not happen to a nicer company. But what are y'all's thoughts about these numbers? Do you think Indiana Jones is going to lose $250 million, $300 million? Again, those are kind of where I think the film will end up being, depending on where your metric is. Either way, it's going to be a gigantic failure. But also what's happening with Ruby Gillman, Teenage Kraken. Again, I did not expect this film to do much of anything because it just did not seem all that impressive. But if you have seen it, let me know. And do you think that there's going to be some positive word of mouth that could end up getting this film to have a Puss in Boots type run? I think Puss in Boots had a much higher start, and so it's already not in a good position to do so. But would love to hear your thoughts on this nonetheless. But let me know your thoughts about anything else I mentioned in the comment section down below. If you like this video, smash that like button, like that 5-button Odyssey, and smash the Rumble button. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, God bless. And now for a huge special shout out to all of my June Patreon Subscribe Star and Locals members at the Keeper of the Bifrost level and above. Starting off first with Patreon, Father Luca Illich, Heimir Irie Hymason, Garrett Searles, Joe Horn, Jonathan Carney, Orange Hat Reviews, you can check it over at his YouTube channel, Orange Hat Reviews, Laura, the Modern Major General Story, Rosetta Allen, who you can check out at her YouTube channel of Eagle Rider, and Miss Martin Muses, who you can check out at her YouTube channel by the same name as well. Also to my Subscribe Star peeps, Matt317, check out his Twitch channel by the same name, Fast Reaction, The R, Mr. Roy, J-Rod the Beer Guru, and ZK Man, who you can check out over at xtheboundaries.co. And lastly, to my Locals members, Miss Minnesota Hockey Fan, How About a Hockey Player, J.H. Schwalbach, and Robert Barnes, the amazing lawyer. And again, thank you all very much for being my supporters. If you want your name shout out at the end of every live stream and every video, check out the top link in the video description below. You also can get access to things like a giveaways channel where I give away Blu-rays, 4K steelbooks, all kinds of stuff every single, most weeks in the month. I try to give away something, or at the very least towards the end of the month, I will make it up with several giveaways. Basically, most people are guaranteed to walk away with something at the end of every single month. So if you want access to that, again, check out the top link in the video description below, as well as access to an exclusive podcast. This past month, I was actually able to record a great podcast with Michelle from Force of Light Entertainment. So you want access to that and also a plethora of other content, check out the link in the video description below. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, God bless.